There's a version of John Carpenter's The Thing that most people have never seen. Not a director's cut, not a sequel, not a reboot, but a shadow film assembled from the scraps and discarded footage that Carpenter and his editors quietly buried during post-production in 1982. These are the scenes that were deemed too slow, too revealing, too expensive, or simply too strange to survive the final cut. And for decades, most of them stayed hidden, locked in studio vaults, passed around in bootleg collector circles, or simply lost to time. When fragments finally began surfacing on special edition DVDs and in online fan communities, they didn't just satisfy curiosity, they cracked open an entirely new debate about one of the greatest horror films ever made. Because once you see what was left on the cutting room floor, you start asking a question that has no easy answer. Did removing these scenes make a thing better? Or did it quietly cut the heart out of something even more extraordinary? To understand why those deleted scenes matter so much, you first have to understand what made the finished film so powerful in the first place. The Thing is not a movie that works through spectacle alone, though its practical effects remain genuinely astonishing more than 4 decades later. It works because of atmosphere. It works because of what it withholds. Carpenter understood something that very few horror directors have ever truly grasped, that the most terrifying thing in any room is a thing you cannot confirm. The alien creature at the center of the film is not frightening because it is monstrous. It is frightening because it is invisible. It looks like a person. It sounds like a person. It passes every casual test of normalcy until suddenly it does not. And by the time the characters realize something is wrong, they have no way of knowing how wrong things already are. The paranoia that this generates is not background noise in the film. It is the film. Strip that away, and you have something completely different. That is exactly what many of the deleted scenes threaten to do. Several of the cut sequences involve extended conversations between characters, longer exchanges that give the men of Outpost 31 more personality, more history, more of a sense of who they were before the terror began. On the surface, this sounds like a good thing. More character development is usually considered a virtue in storytelling, but in the specific architecture of the thing, it creates a problem. The film's paranoia is fueled in part by the fact that we barely know these men. We cannot fully read them. We do not have enough context to rule anyone out. When deleted scenes start filling in those gaps, when characters share personal stories, express warmth toward one another, or demonstrate loyalty in ways that feel definitive, it subtly dismantles the suspicion that Carpenter so carefully constructed. Familiarity, in this case, is the enemy of fear. One of the most discussed categories of cut footage involves scenes that reveal more about the alien creature itself, its behavior, its biology, its apparent logic. In the finished film, the thing operates almost like a force of nature. It has no dialogue, no stated motivation, no comprehensible agenda beyond survival and replication. It does not explain itself. It simply acts. This opacity is one of the most chilling things about it. When deleted sequences begin to illuminate how the creature thinks or what its strategy actually is, something essentially evaporates. The monster becomes, paradoxically, less frightening the more you understand it. Horror often lives at the edge of comprehension, and the thing is a masterclass in keeping that edge razor sharp. The deleted scenes frequently pull back from that edge in ways that feel generous but are ultimately undermining. Then there's a matter of the alternate endings, and this is where the debate gets genuinely heated. The ending that Carpenter settled on is one of the most famous and most argued about conclusions in horror cinema. McCready and Child sit together in the freezing wreckage of Outpost 31, the station destroyed, rescue impossible, and neither man able to fully trust the other. They share a bottle of scotch in what might be a gesture of exhausted peace, or might be the last quiet moment before one of them reveals something monstrous. Carpenter cuts to black and leaves you there. It is a masterpiece of sustained ambiguity, and it has generated theories, arguments, and passionate disagreement for over 40 years. The deleted alternate endings are considerably less comfortable with that ambiguity. One version had McCready rescued and subjected to a blood test that confirmed he was human, a clean, definitive answer to the film's central question. Another version removed Childs entirely, leaving McCready alone in the snow, which at least reserved some bleakness, but eliminated the electric uncertainty of two men who cannot trust each other sharing the same final frame. Editor Todd Ramsey reportedly felt the original ending was too dark for test audiences and pushed for something more conclusive. Carpenter resisted, famously despising what he called the cheesy quality of the happier version. He was right to resist. The ambiguous ending is not just a stylistic preference. It is a thesis statement of the entire film. Everything the thing says about paranoia, identity, and the collapse of trust lives inside that final scene. Replacing it with resolution, however satisfying in the short term, would have been a profound artistic mistake. Behind all of these creative decisions lies a story of genuinely brutal filmmaking conditions that is worth understanding in its own right. The production of the thing was, by nearly every account, an extraordinary ordeal. Shooting began in 1981 near Juneau, Alaska, in genuinely hostile winter terrain, with untouched snowfields, rocky outcrops, and mountain peaks surrounding a crew that had to contend with freezing temperatures, constant weather delays, and equipment that literally could not function in the cold. Camera lenses froze and cracked. Gear had to be left outside overnight simply to stay operational, because bringing it indoors caused condensation that took hours to clear. When production moved to the Universal lot in California, the exterior temperature was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but the sound stages had to be kept at near-freezing temperatures to maintain the visual integrity of the icy sets, which were cooled using banks of portable air conditioners, humidifiers, and misters. Some of the deleted footage reflects these production pressures directly. Certain cut sequences involved elaborate special effects work or complex creature transformations that were simply too expensive or too technically demanding to complete within the film's budget. The original conception of Benning's death, for example, involved the character being dragged under the ice and slowly transformed, a sequence that would have required a hydraulic-driven set, coordinated stunt work, and a level of practical effects complexity that the production simply could not sustain. What ended up in the finished film is a simpler, more ambiguous version of the same story beat, and arguably more effective for its restraint. Similarly, an entire snowmobile chase sequence involving the sled dogs was scripted and eventually abandoned when the budget made impossible. These were not artistic choices, at least not initially. They were economic ones, but they shaped the film in ways that ultimately served its strengths. Some of the cut material is simply strange in ways that are hard to categorize. There is a matter of a scene involving McCready and an inflatable doll, reportedly present while you watch videotapes from the Norwegian camp, which is intended to set up a subsequent jump scare involving gnolls. It is a kind of dark, absurdist detail that might have fit a different kind of horror film, but would have felt tonally bizarre in the cold, controlled atmosphere Carpenter was building. Cutting it was almost certainly the right call, but its existence is a reminder of how different the film's texture might have been if different choices had been made throughout. The character deaths, too, were substantially revised between script and screen. Fuchs, who in the finished film is discovered as a burned corpse in the snow, his death ambiguous, possibly self-inflicted to avoid assimilation, was apparently depicted in an earlier version as impaled against a wall with a shovel driven through him. It is a more viscerally explicit image, but the ambiguity of the burned body is far more psychologically disturbing. The question of whether Fuchs chose to burn himself rather than be taken is one of the film's quieter horrors, and spelling out his death in more graphic terms would have replaced that philosophical chill with simple shock. Gnolls suffered an even more dramatic revision. In an earlier version of the climax, Gnolls was a return to the action partially transformed, a tentacled, half-assimilated creature caught between human and alien form. In the finished film, he simply disappears during the chaos, his fate left entirely open. Both versions of his ending are disturbing, but the disappearance is, again, more unsettling for what it refuses to confirm. What all of this points to, finally, is a principle that the thing demonstrates more forcefully than almost any other film in its genre: the power of omission. Great horror is not made from accumulation, but from selection. The scenes that Carpenter cut, the character backstories, the creature explanations, the definitive endings, the explicit deaths, each represented something real and filmically legitimate. They were not bad ideas. In a different film, many of them would have worked beautifully. But in The Thing, they were in competition with something more important: the experience of not knowing, And not knowing in this film is everything. The alien creature itself operates on this principle. It is terrifying because it could be anyone. The film is terrifying for the same reason, because it refuses to resolve into something safe and comprehensible. What was deleted was not just footage, it was certainty. And the thing has always been at its most powerful when certainty is the one thing no one can afford. Melissa Gilbert spent decades carefully managing her public image. She was America's little Laura Ingalls, wholesome, beloved, the kind of face that parents trusted and children adored. She built an entire career on that foundation, and for a long time she seemed to live inside it comfortably enough. But the older she got, the more that careful image began to crack at the edges. And what emerged from underneath, it was something considerably more complicated and, ultimately, far more interesting than the prairie girl the world thought it knew. By the time she began speaking openly about the most difficult chapters of her personal life, the failed marriages, the addiction, the financial collapse, the years of silence and shame, she had stopped protecting anyone, including herself. And that honesty, arriving after so much careful quiet, landed with the force of something long overdue. To understand what Melissa Gilbert eventually exposed, you have to understand what she spent so many years concealing. Her first major relationship was with Rob Lowe, a romance that began when both of them were teenagers navigating early fame in the glare of Hollywood. By her own account in her memoir, Prairie Tale, published in 2009, the relationship was intense and consuming and ultimately devastating. She described a version of herself who was hopelessly in love with someone who was not ready to love her back in the same way, who was, in fact, loving other people simultaneously. The heartbreak of that relationship, she wrote, set patterns in motion that would take her decades to fully understand. She chased unavailability. She confused chaos for passion. She mistook the feeling of longing for the feeling of love. Her first marriage, to actor Bo Brinkman in 1988, produced a son but did not survive the pressures that came with it. Her second marriage, to actor Bruce Boxleitner, lasted longer and appeared from the outside to be stable, even enviable. For years, Gilbert played the role of devoted wife and mother with the same professionalism she brought to every performance. What she did not discuss publicly, not during the marriage, not in the years immediately following the 2011 divorce, was how much of that stability was performance. How much of what looked like a solid life was held together by pills and willpower and the sheer force of refusing to acknowledge what was actually happening inside it. The addiction piece of Gilbert's story is one of the most significant and most carefully detailed parts of what she has shared publicly. She has spoken and written about a dependence on prescription medication. Painkillers primarily, that grew slowly enough that she did not recognize it as dependence for years. It crept into her life under the cover of legitimate medical use, after surgeries and injuries that genuinely required pain management. But it stayed long after the medical necessity had passed, and it reshaped her in ways she could only see in retrospect. She has described the particular cruelty of that kind of addiction, the way it does not announce itself, the way it disguises itself as coping, the way it allows you to function well enough that everyone around you and you yourself can maintain the fiction that everything is fine. Financial disaster arrived alongside the personal unraveling. Gilbert has been remarkably candid about the fact that at a certain point in her life, she was essentially broke, that decades of earnings had been mismanaged, that she had trusted people she should not have trusted with money she had worked her whole life to accumulate, and that the security she had assumed was permanent turned out to be an illusion. She has talked about losing her home, about the particular shame of financial failure, when you have been a visible public success, about the way that shame compounds on itself, because you feel you have no right to complain. You were famous. You were successful. What do you have to be upset about? That internal negotiation, she has said, kept her silent for far longer than the silence served her. The marriage that finally changed everything was her third, to actor and writer Timothy Busfield, whom she married in 2013. By this point in her life, Gilbert was in a different place than she had been in either of her previous marriages. She had done enough therapy, enough recovery work, enough honest reckoning with her own patterns to know what she had been doing wrong. She was not looking for someone to save her or to validate her or to give her life a shape that she could not construct herself. She was looking, perhaps for the first time, for an actual partner, Someone who was interested in her as a full person rather than a public image or a romantic project. By her account, Busfield turned out to be exactly that. What Gilbert has exposed about her past, in the context of her present happiness, is not a single dramatic revelation, but rather a sustained act of retroactive honesty. She has looked back at the choices she made, the people she chose, the version of herself she presented to the world for so long, and she has said clearly and without excessive self-pity, that was not real. The marriages that looked functional were not always functional. The contentment that read as contentment in photographs was not always contentment in private. The woman who appeared so settled and so steady was, for significant stretches of time, neither of those things. She was performing stability while quietly falling apart, and the performance was good enough that almost no one noticed, including, for a long time, herself. The moment she has described as most clarifying was not any single confrontation or crisis, but rather a gradual accumulation of smaller recognitions. She began to see, slowly, that the way she had learned to be in relationships, accommodating to the point of self-erasure, conflict avoidant, focused entirely on managing the emotional temperature of whoever she was with rather than attending to her own needs, was not love. It was a survival strategy. It was the adaptive behavior of someone who had learned very early that her value was conditional, that she had to perform in order to belong, that the self underneath the performance was not quite enough on its own. Unlearning that took years and a great deal of professional help. She has been direct about the therapy, about the recovery, about the specific, unglamorous work of rebuilding a relationship with yourself after you have spent most of your life building relationships with other people at your own expense. There is nothing sensational in how she talks about it. No dramatic narrative of rock bottom and triumphant resurrection, though the elements of that story are all present. It is quieter than that. She sounds, when she discusses these things, like someone who has simply decided that honesty is less exhausting than the alternative, that the energy she spent for so many years on careful image management was energy she could have been spending on something more worthwhile. The picture that emerges from everything Melissa Gilbert has shared publicly about her life is of a woman who was shaped by forces she did not choose. Early fame, a complicated relationship with her adoptive parents, an industry that commodified her likeness from childhood, and who spent much of her adult life working within those shapes without fully questioning them. The questioning, when it finally came, was thorough and unsentimental. She did not excuse her former partners entirely, but she also did not make them into villains. She was interested in her own role in the patterns she kept repeating, which is a harder and more useful kind of honesty than simple blame.